Welcome to chapter 12 of Intro to Psychology. This is our final chapter for this semester, and it's the first of two parts on social psychology. Social psychology, one of the most interesting and applicable fields of psychology. I always say if I wasn't studying clinical psychology, I would be a social psychologist. It's so interesting and so relevant to everyday life, particularly now as we are in the midst of a pandemic. So, what is social psychology? So, social psychology is the study of individual thoughts, feelings, and behaviors, and how they are influenced by social situations. Another way of saying that is social psychology is the study of how individuals behave in society or in groups or in the presence of other people. At the beginning of the semester, I brought up that probably the central question in the field of psychology is it all boils down to this idea of why do people behave the way they do? Why does that person behave that way? Is that person's behavior abnormal, or is it normal, or is it adaptive? Why do people behave the way they do? And that's really most prominently seen in the field of social psychology. The first prominent topic that we'll cover in this field is the topic of attributions. Attributions are explanations that we have about people's behavior. And so an attribution, whenever we try to make an explanation about why someone is behaving a particular way, whether it be something explicit that we say or just something that we think to ourselves and keep inside, we tend to try to make explanations for why people are the way they are or why they behave the way they do. And there's generally two camps of making attributions. There are dispositional attributions or internal attributions, which is where a person's behavior, we believe that it's being caused by their disposition, by their personality, by their character, by their inner traits, by their fundamental characteristics, by who they are as a person. And then there are situational attributions or external attributions. And those are the belief that a person's behavior is caused by the situation or whatever circumstance they find themselves in at a given moment. And so the truth is that if for most people's behavior, as we've already explored this semester, there's a mix of genetics and environment that influences how people develop and who they are. Similarly, in social psychology, there's a mix between a person's disposition, their personality, or their character, and the situation, what situation they find themselves in. You likely did an experiment in lab where you looked at personality and how personality differs based on who you're describing or what situation you find yourself in. So there's many variables to explain why a person's behavior is the way it is in any given situation. However, as humans, we find this very, very interesting phenomenon in which people tend to make dispositional attributions when thinking about themselves and tend to make situational attributions when talking about other people. So, for example, if you've ever been driving, let's say you're driving on the highway and someone swerves in front of you, they kind of cut you off without indicating that they're changing into your lane, and it's kind of sudden. I know that in that moment, if I'm the driver, start to get that little bit of that feeling of road rage, that feeling of feeling angry against the other driver. And what kinds of things do people say when they're experiencing road rage, when they feel like someone has wronged them on the road? They tend to start to say things like, that person is a horrible driver, or, that's a Detroit driver. Detroit drivers are horrible. They're just the worst, right? Or that person is a insert your favorite swear word. We when we're describing other people who have wronged us on the road, or that we perceive that they've done something wrong, we tend to make attributions about their fundamental nature, about who they are. That person is a bad driver. However, if you're like me and you've ever found yourself in the other side of that situation, you're driving, or maybe you're listening to the radio, or maybe you just temporarily have a slip, and you forget to indicate, or you forget to do something that you would usually do on the road, and then you get honked on, from someone behind you, or get yelled at by someone who's angry at you. And what do you feel about yourself in that situation? You, if you're like most people, you probably don't say, "Oh yes, I'm a horrible driver," just like that person described me to be. More likely, you're going to say, "Oh, something just happened. It was just the situation. Like I just got temporarily distracted. I know I'm a good driver, but it was just." the situation that caused my behavior to be that way. We call this phenomenon fundamental attribution error. That when we are explaining other people's behavior, we tend to make dispositional attributions about their behavior. But when we're explaining our own behavior, we tend to make situational attributions. We tend to downplay the dispositional elements and rate highly the situational influences on our behavior. So take a look at this little comic here. Charlie Brown, or not Charlie Brown, but this Charlie Brown comic, where the person is saying, "Why are you always so anxious to, or so ready to criticize me?" And there's so many people who can relate to Lucy here who have a knack for seeing other people's faults, but when it comes to your own faults, you have a knack for overlooking them. And this is something that we see over and over again. Another example, you're sitting at the airport and you see someone trip and fall over. You might think, oh, what an idiot. Like, oh, that person is so clumsy. That person is such a, just such a weird or awkward person. And you're thinking those thoughts, what we call that is a dispositional attribution. You are making an attribution about that person's fundamental nature, who they are fundamentally. Whereas a situational attribution would be to think something like, oh, maybe that person is late for a flight and they're running through the airport, they're rushing, that there's some element outside of who they are in their fundamental nature that has caused their behavior to occur. And so we see this over and over again in so many different situations where people tend to make fundamental attributions rather than situational ones. However, we also know that fundamental attribution error isn't a universal phenomenon. That we know that people who live in individualistic cultures have a greater tendency to commit fundamental attribution errors, whereas people in collectivistic cultures, such as some Eastern or particularly East Asian cultures or South Asian cultures, where there's a much greater emphasis on relationships and working together and living in community, those individuals benefit from having a broader perspective on both situational and dispositional attributions. We see this all the time in so many ways playing out in politics and in society, where someone's behavior is captured on a phone or captured on a video, and the automatic assumption is to make attributions about who that person is and their fundamental nature. That person is a sexist. That person's behavior means that they are necessarily a racist. That person's behavior means that they are, just fundamentally evil. We tend to make attributions about people's fundamental nature while ignoring any situational influences. Related to the concept of fundamental attribution error is the concept of some other cognitive biases. We discussed cognitive biases in, I believe it was chapter 7. And here are some additional biases that come to play, particularly in social situations. So the actor-observer bias is one of them. The phenomenon of explaining other people's behaviors are due to internal factors, and our own behaviors are due to situational forces. So for example, there were some researchers who did a study that investigated why some young men liked their girlfriend, why they wanted to be with their girlfriend, what their reasons for being with them were. And what they found was that when the young men were asked to explain other people's reasons for being with their significant other, they tended to make dispositional attributions about their behavior and about their desire to be with them. But when it came down to explaining their own reasons for being with their girlfriend, they tended to make situational attributions, right? It was the situation that brought them together. That it was all these things, all these external factors that led them to be together. So this is another example of how fundamental attribution error is at work, particularly when there's a discrepancy between you as the actor or you as the observer. Another is the self-serving bias. The self-serving bias, which is the tendency of an individual to take credit by making dispositional or internal attributions for positive outcomes but situational or external attributions for negative outcomes. So this one is different because it depends on the outcome. So for example, when you are judging your own behavior, when you're thinking about your own behavior after getting a positive result, like getting a good grade, it's the end of the semester, you see an A on your transcript, and you start to think to yourself, I got a good grade because I'm smart, because I work hard, because I know how to ask for help, because I'm a good student. All these reasons that are dispositional. They're about who you are as a person, ignoring the situational factors. But if you get a bad grade, then all of a sudden it's situational. The teacher was against me. I was busy with all my classes. I got sick the day of the exam. There are all kinds of random or unpredictable situational factors that led me to do poorly. The self-serving bias is influenced by these three factors. One, the locus of control, stability, and how controllable the situation is. So we tend, when there's a positive outcome, an outcome in our favor, we tend to say that, oh, the locus of control is internal. It's something that I could control. It was within my realm of control. So for example, when your sports team wins, the team that you're following wins, you might say that, oh, it's because that my team is talented, my team is really good. You might also say that they have some stable characteristics, like they work hard. They're generally a hardworking team. They worked hard over the course of the season, so of course they deserve to win. And then you might also say that they use, they have good strategies for dealing with or from bouncing back from losses, or they have a good practice facility, or they have good coaching staff, or they have other resources that allow them to control the situation. But when your team loses, it's because, oh, my team was playing away from home, the refs were against us, the weather was against us, all these other external and also uncontrollable or random scenarios influenced the outcome when it's negative. Another such bias is the just world hypothesis, which is related to how we judge other people's behavior. It's the notion that people get the outcomes they deserve. And to some extent, that's true. Sometimes, there are some uncanny instances of karma, but oftentimes this belief that, people will necessarily reap what they sow in all situations can be very, very misleading, and is a very, very commonly held idea, particularly here in the Western world. So for example, if you are judging someone else's behavior regarding whether or not they catch the novel coronavirus, whether they or not they get infected, if you find out that the person whose behavior you're evaluating didn't catch COVID-19, you might say that, oh, well, they didn't catch COVID-19 because they had a good hand washing hygiene, or they wore a mask consistently. They were a good person. They were contributing to society, or they were, doing the recommended public health practices. So therefore, they didn't catch COVID-19. And then someone else who catches COVID-19, you might start to think, well, they probably aren't a good hand washer, or they probably haven't been washing their hands consistently, or they probably didn't wear a mask consistently. Or you might try to look through their Facebook and see, oh yeah, you went outside without a mask. And you might look for things, confirmation bias, look for things that support your hypothesis. When in reality, the just world hypothesis isn't exactly true when it comes to COVID-19. We know that many individuals who have stayed home and have followed all the guidance from the CDC and other organizations, or from the state, who have washed their hands, or who have worn masks, have still caught the virus because it's such a contagious thing. And we also know many individuals who are not paying attention to any public health guidelines, who are doing fine and aren't catching the virus. So the idea that people will necessarily reap what they sow is really an overestimation. It's a bias in our thinking, that we like to blame people for their circumstances instead of looking at situational forces.